All right, so let's talk about asynchronous JavaScript. Asynchronous JavaScript is pretty much everywhere on the web right there, and it, for the most part, is designed to make your web experience more pleasant and faster. Whether or not you've noticed, you've probably used asynchronous code all the time. If you use Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or YouTube or any of those, you've used asynchronous code because when you scroll to the bottom of the page, you find there are more posts or tweets or videos, whatever, already loading up at the bottom of the page. You can just scroll forever. That's asynchronous JavaScript. The page doesn't need to refresh. You don't need to click on something to say, take me to page 2 of the content. It'll just keep on showing you more and more content the further down you go. Another example would be Google Maps. Go to maps.google.com. So right now, we just made a request to go to Google Maps, and it took me to a specific place. I can, move around like this. I can search for pizza. I can do that. I can go to, click on this place. I didn't know SmackDev had pizza. I can go to Street View and take a look at it. This is all asynchronous code. The page hasn't refreshed one time since I've come here. So that's what asynchronous code can do for us. It allows us to provide a great user experience without having to actually physically reflow the page, and that makes things flow better, and it just makes things nicer for everybody. So we're going to be learning how to use that today. In the past, and I mentioned this a little bit on Monday, we used a library called jQuery to make what's asynchronous JavaScript calls, which are also called AJAX. So if you ever see AJAX calls, that's also referring to an asynchronous call. And you'll probably still run into it in legacy code, but we're going to be using the modern way, which is by using a new JavaScript method, a library called Fetch API to make get and post requests. And we just talked about this. Get methods are for receiving data, and posting methods are for adding data. So in other words, get methods are non-destructive. They just get data from the server but don't change it. And a post method is destructive because you're changing the data on the server somehow, like creating a new comment. So I'm going to open this up. I'm going to make a new HTML file. I'll call this async JavaScript. Make sure I link it up to my javascript.js. And inside the div, I'm going to add a few things. So I'm going to add, in the body, I'm going to add a few things. First, a div. I'm going to give this one a class. Let's call it container. And add just, a header. Give it an ID. Let's call it heading. Welcome to my website. Maybe I'll put something right here. Give this one an ID of article 1. And this will be a fascinating article. So that's just, very standard HTML stuff, nothing we haven't seen before. I'm going to open it up just to make sure there's no issues. There shouldn't be at this point. Oops, wrong thing. Open index.html, thank you. There it is. So this part of the page is going to remain static. It's never going to change. But we're also going to have another part of our page that's going to change depending on a response we get from an outside source. So I'm going to write another div, and I'll call it, give it a class of response data. And the purpose of this is inside this div is where I'm going to put any data I get from the GET request I'm going to be making. So now I'm going to head over to my script.js. The first thing I need to do is I need to actually grab our container so that we can actually modify it. So I can say const response container. And I can, there's many ways I can traverse the DOM to get it. This time I'm going to use documents.querySelector. which query selector gives us the first thing it finds with the selected query, which in this case is going to be the class response data. So dot response data. And I'm doing this instead of get elements by class name, because that way I don't have to worry about having a whole list. I just have one. So before we actually get into the new stuff, any questions about what I've done so far? I know this is all pretty, this is stuff you've seen before, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page before we actually start, getting data. Okay, so to use the fetch library, it's very simple. You type in fetch, and then you type in the name of the website you're actually making a request to. And in this case, I'm going to be making a request to, let's see if it's working today, because it's sometimes not worked, placeholder.typicode.com or .com/todos/1. So Json Placeholder is a website that just has placeholder data. So you can make fetch requests and HTTP requests to it and receive data. And that way you can actually see it and practice making fetch requests without having to actually get like an API key or anything like that. And does anyone know what type of data we're looking at right now?
JSON.
Yep, this is JSON. And JSON, it stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Even though it's got JavaScript in the name, it's not actually JavaScript. It's just modeled after JavaScript objects. And so right now, the goal is to get this data, the user ID, title, completed, false, all of that. I want to get it from here onto my web page. The problem is that JSON though it looks like text, is not plain text. It's a specific type of data. And when it gets sent over, it's going to be converted into plain text, and then we're going to have to convert it back into this. Also, a thing to keep in mind is that when you visit a website with a JSON endpoint like this, it won't typically look this nice. It'll usually look something more like this. That's because I'm using a Chrome extension called JSON Viewer. If you haven't downloaded that already, please do. It's going to make your life so much easier. So anyway, we have our endpoint. So I'm going to go to https://JSON placeholder.typicode.com/todos/1. And that's how you make a GET request. But I'm going to add something new that you probably haven't seen before. I'm going to write .then. And I'm going to explain this after I show you what it does. I'll explain how it works step by step. resp.json. I have another .then. JSON this. And then I'm going to say response container .inner HTML equals JSON.title. And if this works, we should see our new page not working. All right. So before I actually debug this, I want to go over what I just did step by step. So I've been throwing around this word a bunch of times, asynchronous JavaScript, but I haven't really told you what that means yet. Synchronous JavaScript is what we have been doing. And synchronous code is literally just one thing runs after another. So, we define const response container, we set equal to that, we could say console.log something, console.log something else, and it'll run line by line by line, one after the other. That isn't always an option, though, when we have something like a fetch request, because even if it doesn't seem to take very long at all, whenever you make a HTTP request, it does take some amount of time, a non-zero amount of time to run. Depending on the size of the data you're trying to transmit and all of that, it can change. And if you try to get data synchronously, then your website will be entirely hung up until that fetch request is complete. nothing else can run until this thing is done. So a fetch request allows us to run this code asynchronously, meaning that we can actually run code after the fetch request is done. And so the fetch request will start going, and then anything down here will still work. So if I open up this, oh, it actually did work. So I refresh the page. So I got hello. And that ran. I haven't gotten any errors, which makes me think the fetch request is just taking a very long time. But this console.log still ran. So the question is, what about these .thens? And so what I'm actually going to do, actually, no, I'm going to wait on that. But so a fetch request returns something called a promise. And a promise is a JavaScript object which just says, I'm going to show you something. Something is going to appear here once this fetch request is complete. Until then, here's something you can hold on to. A .then is designed to say, all right, once the promise is resolved, meaning once the fetch request is complete, only then will a .then run. And what I've told this .then to do is say the parameter is going to be the response, and we're going to run resp.json, which will turn it from plain text into a JSON object. And then .thens can be chained together. So I said, after this .then resolves, run this .then, and says, all right, take the return value of this, which we're calling JSON, and we want to take that and then do this, change the inner HTML of our response container into the JSON.title. Ah, there it is. So hopefully your your fetch request won't take this long, but they might. So I'm going to take a little bit to show you this in action a little bit now. I'm going to comment this. I'm going to comment these out actually.
No, I had a quick question. The .thens, are they methods of fetch, or are they just a new line? I'm a little confused about the dot in front of the then.
So .then is we're essentially chaining it on to the fetch. So we could run it essentially like this. We're saying fetch
Okay.
and then .then, but putting them on separate lines just makes it easier to read.
I didn't even know you could do that. You could do this with other methods too?
Depending on whether or not it has a method like this. So, because the .then isn't actually a method of fetch, it's a method of a promise. And I'm going to show you what a promise looks like right now.
Okay.
Going to console.log fetch. And so we can see what we console.log is called a promise, and right now it's pending. But then very quickly the promise gets resolved. So we're saying the return value of fetch is a promise. And then once you have that promise, you can put a .then onto it, saying, okay, once we have it, then we need to actually do something with it. I'm just going to change this one step at a time. So if I look at my .then, I'd say, all right, once the promise is resolved, I want to console.log it. So we see here we get a response. It's got a type, it's got a URL, it's got all of this stuff. But we can also say, all right, what does resp.json look like? And that's taking quite a bit longer. But essentially that using .json will take the promise and the response and automatically parse it into an object that we can actually interact with, something that looks like this. So yeah, we're still waiting on this promise to we're still waiting on it to be parsed into JSON. I don't know why it's taking so long.
The response.json is not also producing a promise, because aren't you chaining, you're chaining a then to it? Does it not need to be a promise?
That's a good question. So it doesn't produce a promise, but .thens are designed to be chained onto each other. So the first .then is saying, all right, working to this promise. The second .then is just waiting for that to actually be resolved. So I can just keep on adding .thens to this, whether or not there's actually a promise involved at the end of the day. So I don't want to keep you waiting here until until this thing is done working, because that's going to take a while by the look of it. But the idea is the return value of this anonymous function is going to be passed in as the parameter of the next one in the next .then. Okay, this time it works very quickly. Okay, whatever. Any questions about fetch and .then?
Within the then, the RESP, is that any variable name you technically want? You just kind of used it as you named it that way because it's a response. So we could have called it Steve or something, right?
Yeah, you can call it anything you want. It's just a variable name. I like using RESP for short for response, but it's entirely up to you.
Okay. Yeah, I just wasn't sure, if there's certain keywords that need to be used. Obviously, fetch would be one of the things that is for this method and function, but everything else after that is kind of optional. Okay.
Mm-hmm. What's the deal with the arrow? I think I've only seen it with arrow functions. What does it represent there?
So this is actually also an arrow function. It's just a very like whenever you define an arrow function, you could say, you don't in the past we've kind of made them look like this, perhaps. Do a thing.
Right.
But you can also do arrow functions as one line if there's only one line to do. So you can define an arrow function like, or I guess you still need the brackets here. Or now it's giving me a problem. Expecting a semicolon. All right, not sure why it's doing this, but within the context of a .then at least, as long as you can do it in one line, you can just define it like this. So here's the argument. It's an arrow response.json. If it's going to take more than one line, you could do something like, separate it by multiple lines by adding this bracket and say, let title equal json.title, and then do response container dot inner HTML equals title. So these are just two different ways of writing in an arrow function.
And with arrow functions for parameters, if you're only passing in one parameter, you don't need parentheses around it. But if you're passing in multiple parameters in an arrow function, you need multiple.
Yeah.
Or you need parentheses around it.
Yeah, you need the parentheses if there's going to be multiple parameters or no parameters. But one parameter just allows you to do it without.
Might be a dumb question, but if it's no parameters, do you just do it's right away the arrow?
If there was no parameters, then you would just use close parentheses like this.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Got it.
No worries. All right, so so that's a GET request, very basic. Now I'm going to try to make something we can post data to. So I'm going to use a place called putsrec.com. So this is another thing that allows you to mimic HTTP responses, but this allows you to kind of make a little bucket that we can send data to. So maybe going a little slow or very slow. All right. If anyone has another website that is faster than putsrec, I'm all ears.
I'm working on setting up a fake server, but it still depends on it, so we'll see if it works. Give me about 2 minutes.
Yeah, and there's plenty of other, there are other services that allow us to do this. So I would do, search for API request mocker, perhaps. or like fake JSON API server for testing. Let's see what fake JSON does. All right, I don't want to do anything with an API token because that's just too much effort right now. What does mock server do? No, this is also a tool to use, not an actual website. Dang, this is putting a spanner in my plans for sure.
Almost there.
Okay, what about this one, Maki?
Can I ask another question about that arrow function? Sorry.
Sure.
Do you mind if we go back to your VS Code?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so for number 4, why do we even need an arrow function? Why can't it just be rsp.json?
As in, why don't we just do this?
Yes. I guess I'm not clear on why we need to execute a function that returns just one thing.
So in this case, .then is designed to take a function as an argument.
It has to take a function.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's also how we get access to the response, because if I just call resp.json, it doesn't know what resp is. We haven't defined it.
Okay.
But by putting it as part of an anonymous function, we can define resp as our parameter and then manipulate it however we want.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
So I'm going to try, let's see if this Maki thing works at all. So we can actually create a body. So we can something like data is hello world. Don't know why it's red. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Okay, I've got a link here. Okay, let's try this out.
Are you trying to say date or data?
Data, thank you. So I don't know if this is going to work yet. We'll find out. Because it looks like putsrec is let us down. Actually, I'm going to try something else because, well, no, this is just the body.
I think you have to use, you have to use JSON. So the data has to be in quotes.
Oh, thank you. Now they're both red.
I don't know if it's explicit that it has to be double quotes. Maybe that's why it's red, but maybe not.
All right, so this allows us to make GET requests. It doesn't really allow us to make POST requests. But we can still make a POST request. We can just tell it to react however we want. Oh, man. This isn't as fun as I was hoping it would be. Oh, well. So I'm going to, try to, so I can still make POST requests to this endpoint, I believe. And I'll still get a response back. It just won't actually save any data. So hopefully this will still work. If not, I apologize, but we're going to have to update our README to use something else. In the meantime, I'm going to update my index. I'm going to add a form. I'll get rid of action. I'll change this to ID. Let's call it comment form. I'm going to give it an input, type equals text. We'll give it its own ID as well, comment. We'll also give it a name. I'm just going to equal name. And I'm going to add another input. I'm going to make the type of this one submit. And then I'm going to add a div below this form and give this one the ID of post response.
What's the distinguishing characteristics between ID and name on line 19 there?
Good question. So an ID is mainly for DOM manipulation purposes. So we can find our input very quickly by just finding something with the ID of comment. Name is kind of more this name helps us format the actual data that we're going to be sending over through the comment. And we'll kind of get into that in a little bit.
You know, I put a link in chat, but it's not clear to me whether or not you can
All right, I'll take a look.
read it.
Okay, so I've got a fake API point here with posts. And so I can read it. For some reason, the dictionary open. Don't worry about that. Is this my JSON server? Does that allow you to also make post requests?
Yeah, that's what I'm checking right now. I don't know if you can post to it or if it's just read only. So it's pulling out of a GitHub repo that has a db.json file. Yeah, I'm just using that functionality.
All right, so if I can look here, limits, roadmap. It's a REST server, and REST typically means that you should be able to actually post request to it. So I'll try this one too. Thank you. So I'm gonna copy out everything except /1, and we'll see if this works. But in the meantime, I'm gonna actually make this form have some functionality. So I'm going to say const form equals document.querySelector. And I gave it an ID of comment form. So in that case, it'll be hash comment form. And we'll also get the response post response container equal document.querySelector hashtag post response. Did I write that correctly? Yep. And I'm going to say form.addEventListener. It's going to be a submit. And we're going to tell it to run a function. So I'm actually going to write this function out as function the old way. Function is going to take event as a parameter. And I'm going to add something called event.preventDefault. Anyone have any ideas of why I'm doing this and what it actually accomplishes?
In case they left the form blank and they accidentally clicked the submit button before they actually put any data in.
Yep. So event.preventDefault is super, super useful because by default, whenever you submit a form, it'll refresh the page automatically. That's kind of built-in functions to form tags in HTML. But when you add an event listener, you always have the optional parameter to add of event. And once you've added the event, you can say event.preventDefault, which will just prevent the default behavior of whatever element is happening on during this particular event. So in this case, event is the submit event, and we're saying prevent the default behavior, don't refresh the page. And event is actually super, super useful. So I can go, but after we do that, I'll console.log event so we can get a closer look at what's actually happening here. So blah, blah, blah. So we have a submit event. We can say is trusted, submitter is input, type submit, target. So it says what actually is getting hit, the form, hashtag comment form, current target, all this other cool stuff that we don't really need. But the main thing I want to talk about is the target. Because the target is the entire form, which has this thing right here and also the submit button. So what I want to do is I can use the event to actually access this particular value. So I could say let comment equal event.target.elements, and I want the first element, which is the actual input form, .value. And if I console.log comment, I should see whatever I type into the form. There it is. All right, so now I'm going to set a endpoint, const endpoint, and I'm going to set that to the my JSON server, just so we have this saved for later, and hopefully it'll work. We'll find out.
Yeah, it says you can, so we'll see. I'm interested.
All right, so now we're going to make our fetch request. And whenever you're making a post request, it's a bit different than making a get request. Because a get request, you know, unless there's certain circumstances, all you really need to add is the URL and nothing else. You don't need to add any other data. But a post request, we need to tell it some more specific information in order to make it work. So I'm going to say fetch. Our first argument is going to be our endpoint. But then we're going to add some brackets here, and we're going to add an object. There we go. So I'm going to tell it what method it's going to use, which is this is going to be a post request. I'm going to add some headers, which is going to be another object. And in this time, I'm going to tell it its content type is going to be application/JSON. So we're telling the server, this is a post request, and the content we're going to be sending you is JSON. Then finally, in the body, we actually need to send our data. And in this case, I'm going to use json.stringify. And I'm going to stringify the comment. So that's ensuring that our comment will be stringy enough to be sent up as an HTTP request.
Is the content type supposed to be inside of the headers, or is that supposed to be outside?
It's supposed to be inside the headers, yes.
Okay.
So this is kind of the very basic way of doing a post request using fetch, is you do the URL, then you have the method, the headers, and the body. And the body is almost always something that you're calling json.stringify on to make sure that it's actually something, you know, it's actually something that you want. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say .then response.json. And then .then again, this time I'm going to say we have our JSON data. And I just want to look at the data we actually get first before we do anything else to make sure it's actually what, you know, see what we're actually getting from this form when we submit it. Hit submit. Okay, we got a problem. 500 external error. So in this case, our post request to JSON server.typicode/cglusky/faithbpi/post did not work. So in that case, this is something I did wrong. Well, no, sorry, it's something it said it did wrong. So yeah, it doesn't seem to have anything here about how to make a post request to this. You can see their demo here.
Yeah, at the bottom of the demo, it says you can get post, push, right?
Yeah. So I think my main problem here is I'm not entirely sure what the endpoint is, the proper endpoint would be for making a successful post request to this website, because I don't really know how it works. And like convention would say that, you know, posting to typicode.com/fakekpi/posts, that should allow you to create a new post, but it might be different.
So Noah, I use Postman to do it, and it lets you successfully post, and it will actually give you a, you know, you can post like a title. It will give you a response, and it will give you a new ID, like the next ID that's in line. But
okay.
if you try to refetch that data again, it won't be updated. So it won't have persisted it in the database. So you won't see number 2, the item you just created, the resource you just created. It won't be there. But but it will give you a proper response when you do the post.
So for those of you who aren't familiar with Postman, it's a super useful application you can download for your desktop. And allows you to make GET requests and POST requests and all of this. So I can actually try that here. So I'm going to try it in Postman rather than that. I'm going to say Maybe it's because I didn't give it a key value pair. Because I'm going to say in the body, sorry, this is all old stuff. So I'm going to just do like, title is hello, hit send. All right, so it sent back an ID, meaning that it got a successful response. So this gives me an idea of what maybe I did wrong with this, because I just sent it a comment without any actual, like without a key value pair. So let's try it this way. If I do, so if I take a look at this one, so if I do title is comment, like that. Let's see if that changes how this runs on my website. Ah, there we go. So I got what I sent back with an ID, which would normally, in a real server, would mean if it has an ID, that it actually worked and it saved it to the database. But if we look over here, it doesn't actually persist the data because it's just a mock server. But this is the kind of information we'd hope to see on a successful response. So now we can actually say something like, what do we call it? Post response container dot inner text equals JSON dot title. So if I do, blah, 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 my new comment appeared down there. All right, cool. So that was what I was doing wrong, is my body wasn't formatted correctly. That's why the response was coming back wrong. By making sure I said, all right, I'm stringifying an object with a key value, at least one key value pair, that's how it knew what to do with the actual data I was sending it. All right, what questions do you have about posting data?
Is it when we get to the parsing data, is that where the name field's going to come into play from earlier?
Yeah, it's honestly at this point, early point, the name isn't going to make much of a difference. It's going to be more important when we get into things like Django and React, because that allows it to that essentially allows your backend to automatically format form data this way. But right now, we're literally just reaching in and grabbing the value by using event. But in the future, you'll have things like you'll have like automatic forms that if you set them up with a name and things like this, will automatically format the data into a JavaScript object for you without having to go through all this other trouble. So at the moment, you don't really need to worry about the name thing yet, but it will come up later. So again, this is all of this is going to be in the notes for today. So if you ever forget how to format a post request in Fetch, which I do all the time, it's typically, you have your endpoint and then you have an object with method, headers, and a body. And the method will either be post or put or delete or maybe something else. And your headers will usually have what content type you're sending and maybe something else, depending on context. And then your body will be actually the data you're sending up there. And once you get a response, you can interact with it the same way we interacted with it for a GET request. All right, so that is Fetch in a nutshell. Today's challenges, we have a simple to-do page. So it's going to be kind of using all of your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files skills all together. And then we have HTTP server 1, which is really fascinating and very strange. This is going to be something we're going to be continuing over the course of a few days. And so you're actually going to be using Python in that to actually create a server on your page, on your computer. So a very, very basic server. And the goal of this is, again, chances are you're not going to find a job where you're going to be making your own servers, but this will give you a greater understanding of how servers work and how they parse data so that you have a better idea of what your code does when you interact with somebody else's server.
Yep. And over the course of the next 2 days of HTTP server 1, 2, and 3, we're going to be slowly building up to the file structure of what a Django kind of app kind of looks like. So when you see Django for the first time, you'll be like, oh, I've seen this file structure kind of before.
Exactly.
And it is pretty hard.
Yeah. Yeah. There's only 2 challenges today, and they're both kind of doozies. So just keep that in mind and pace yourself.
Just a lot of reading of documentation and Google searching.
Yep. But if you do get through both of them, we also have a stretch goal for creating your own static web page. So that's just, practice. Again, practice makes perfect, both for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, all of that working together. The more you work with it, the more it's going to make sense and the better idea you'll have of what's actually possible in the future. Let me stop recording if it lets me.